here to talk about something that I bet most of you have heard a lot about in the media over the last 2 to 3 years. By that I mean economic sanctions, or simply economic warfare by any other name. Sanctions are not new. They're almost as old as history itself. The first reported use of sanctions was 2,500 years ago in the Peloponnesian Wars, where the city of Athens sanctioned merchants from the port city of Megara. More recent times, the Union blockade of Confederate ports interdicted the very lucrative cotton trade with Great Britain and certainly contributed to the defeat of the Confederacy in the American Civil War. But the full force or horror of sanctions weren't really reached until World War I with devastating effect. The National Health Office in Berlin in 1918 estimated that 750,000 Germans had starved because of the Allied blockade of their ports. Another 300,000 starved in the Ottoman Empire, whose ports were also blockaded by Allied forces. The kind of horror that sanctions created led to a peace movement that called for their abolition. Sanctions were never abolished, but their use fell off markedly after the two great wars. By 1960, only 4 countries in the world were sanctioned, accounting for a trivial slice of global GDP or trade. But in the last decades, sanctions have posted a remarkable, if not spectacular, recovery. Today, there are 54 countries that are sanctioned that include 1/3 of global GDP and trade. And the rate at which new sanctions are being applied, it won't take long before half of global GDP and trade is subject to some form of economic warfare. Far and away, by a country mile, the country that has imposed the most sanctions is the United States. And it doesn't seem to really matter if there's a Republican or Democratic administration. Let me just quote some numbers. During the Obama administration, Washington imposed about 500 sanctions a year. That rose to about 900 under the Trump administration and about 1,200 under the Biden administration. So sanctions have very much become part of the new normal. We would do well to consider its consequences. In fact, we would do well to consider, where will an ever-escalating global economic war lead to? Can the West still win such wars? And if not, what are the consequences of losing? You see, the world is changing, and what we are finding is that America's opponents are trying to build a new world order where there will be not one single global hegemon like the United States, but rather multiple poles. And we're seeing some of the world's economic heavyweights aligning themselves with America's traditional enemies, Russia and China, in an organization known as BRICS that just recently doubled in size and included such bitter enemies as Saudi Arabia and Iran. There's a lineup around the block of countries wanting to join BRICS, including Mexico, for example. And if BRICS were to include all the countries that want to join it, it would basically have a GDP far in excess of the G7, over half of the world's population, about 50% of oil reserves, 2/3 of the world's natural gas reserves. So they are a force to reckon with. Now into its third year, maybe it's time to step back and ask ourselves, what have sanctions actually achieved? They have profoundly changed the nature of the global economy, but after all, that's not what they were intended to do. What they were intended to do is bring Russia to its knees, and clearly that has not happened. The Russian economy did experience a brief recession, but certainly not out of line with the recessions and sanctioning countries themselves, like Germany and the United Kingdom. And in fact, the entire European Union has only recently recovered from recession. And it certainly hasn't halted the Russian war machine. If anything, it's been the catalyst to put the Russian economy on a war footing. So why have sanctions failed? Well, first of all, President Putin has been sanction-proofing the Russian economy at least since 2014, when sanctions were first imposed with the annexation of Crimea. In fact, if you go back in history, I mean, Russians have lived with Western sanctions since the Bolsheviks took power in Moscow. The sanctions applied against Germany were quickly retargeted to Russia. So Western sanctions is nothing new for Russians. There is another factor, and maybe a more important factor. In the past, when Russia was sanctioned by the West, it was isolated. It had to stand alone. Now it has some very, very powerful friends. And its BRICS partners like India and China have welcomed with open arms sanctioned Russian goods into their vast markets. And that's made all the difference. Because as the power of BRICS grows, the effectiveness and scope of Western sanctions shrink. Let me give you an example. The loss of European energy markets to Russia would, in the past, have brought the Russian economy to its knees. Last year, Russia's energy export earnings posted an all-time high. But you know, sanctions haven't just changed where Russia sells its energy. Sanctions have changed in what currency Russia sells its energy. And the victim here is not the Russian ruble. The victim here is the 50-year reign of the petrodollar that has abruptly ended. You see, back in 1974, William Simon, who was Nixon's U.S. Treasury Secretary and former head of Solomon's bond desk, went to Riyadh on a secret mission. And his mission was to get Saudi Arabia to sell its oil only in dollars and then reinvest those dollars into the U.S. Treasuries market. And Saudi Arabia used its leadership position in OPEC for the other members of the cartel to do the same. Well, you can thank Western efforts to sanction the Russian ruble for bringing that to an end, because President Putin did what I think he should have done years ago and said, you want to buy Russian natural gas? You want to buy oil? You want to buy coal? And remember, Russia is the world's largest energy exporters. You pay in rubles or you don't get our energy. And all of a sudden, you know, totally changed the nature of currency in Russia, because 95% of Russian oil, gas, and coal was sold in either dollars or euros prior to sanctions. That had a domino effect, because shortly after that, BRICS partners Saudi Arabia and China, by the way, is Saudi Arabia's major partner, decided that they wouldn't do their trade in dollars anymore. They would instead do their trade in yuan, Iraq is also accepting 1. But actually, the US dollar could potentially lose something far more valuable than simply its role as the petrocurrency. The US dollar, throughout the entire post-war period, has been the one and only reserve currency. What does reserve currency mean? Well, I'll give you an example. If there's a palm oil manufacturer in Malaysia selling it to a supermarket in Indonesia, guess what currency that transaction will be in? It'll be in US dollars, even though neither buyer or seller are American. That's what reserve currency means. It also means that central banks around the world would hold dollars in their foreign reserves. Well, that's changed, because whereas holding dollars in your central bank reserves was always seen as an insurance policy to skate through speculative attacks on your currency, all of a sudden, your dollar reserves have become a ticking time bomb. Because at any moment in time, a decision could be made in Washington to confiscate those foreign reserves, as they confiscated $300 billion of the Central Bank of Russia's dollar assets. And there's no way that a central bank could hedge that risk except one way. It could not hold US dollars or reduce their holdings. And that's exactly what's happening now. The biggest holder of foreign reserves in the world is the People's Bank of China. They have almost $1 trillion of US dollar reserves. I should say they had, because they're selling those dollar reserves at a record pace, and other BRICS central banks are doing the same. And if they continue to do that, it's only a matter of time before King Dollar will have to share its crown with a number of contenders. Sanctions haven't been any more effective against China. And believe me, China's being sanctioned every day just as much as Russia. In the case of China, the goal is to keep China from acquiring advanced semiconductor or chip technology. But that's akin to reversing the laws of economic gravity. And that's why the US is having such problems enforcing that. Because the largest chip market in the world is inexorably going to attract the leading chip technology, because that is where the leading chip technology will get its greatest rate of return. So all of a sudden, Huawei unveils its new iMate phone, complete with 5G technology that it wasn't supposed to have. The company that is most at risk in this economic sanctions war affecting China and the US, and believe me, the stakes are a lot higher, because Russia is America's 30th largest trading partner. China is America's top trading partner. The firm most at risk just happens to be the most valuable firm in the world, Apple, with its $3 trillion market capitalization. Because 95% of the iPhones, iPads, Mac computers that Apple sells are manufactured in China. If push comes to shove, China can live without Apple. But can Apple live without China? Let's just say in this new world of friendshoring, as Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, talks about, where you're only supposed to trade with your friends and you should decouple from your enemies like China. Let's just say that all of a sudden Apple can't source its supply lines. Well, Apple's major supplier in China, Foxconn, pays $1.50 an hour labor. Let's say Apple brought back its production to where it's based, Cupertino, California, where the minimum wage is $15.50. Do you think you still could afford to buy anything that Apple makes? Well, I mean, that's the kind of world that we are increasingly moving to. And what's happened is that while sanctions have not brought Russia or China to its knees, what it has brought to its knees is the very global trading order that we were told is the basis of our collective prosperity for the last 40 years. We were told that globalization is not only inevitable, but beneficial to everyone. Well, if David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage says that everyone gains some international trade, then the same logic says that everybody basically suffers from sanctions. And that, of course, includes you. See, economic lockdowns are, the sanctions that we're seeing today are basically finishing the job that economic lockdowns during COVID started. You know, during COVID, we found out that just-in-time inventory was just too late. And we weren't talking about lawn chairs and tennis shoes. We were talking about desperately needed respirators and masks and vaccines. And for the first time, we began to think that maybe globalization wasn't so inevitable or even preferable. Well, the economic lockdowns, as traumatic as they were a black swan event. They were fleeting. What I'm talking about is not fleeting. It's a permanent change in our economy, and the way that you will notice that change is that every time you go into a grocery store or fill up the tank, you see that, inflation. And the longer sanctions go, the more entrenched inflation becomes. Let me give you a medical metaphor. You know, you have a tumor that starts off as a local tumor, but then metastasizes and spreads through your body. Well, the same things happened with inflation. At first, there was a local shock to food and energy prices. But now, inflation has metastasized into wages. Wages are running at around 6% in the US, 5% in Canada. Wages just don't affect the price of food and energy. Wages affect the price of everything. And why are wages growing? Because the single biggest brake on wage growth has suddenly been removed. You can't just close the factory and move production to China when workers go on strike, because that's not an option anymore with offshoring. Now you got to deal with domestic labor. Strikes are the highest they've been in 30 years. Unionization is growing like it hasn't in decades. Inflation's not a passing blip. It's part of the new normal. In the midst of so much change and uncertainty, it can no longer count on what we've been told you can count on for decades, and that is that seamless global trading system. And while the precise contours of this new world order and the economy that it will bring is yet to be fully revealed, I think one thing is already clear as we seem to pass along this increasingly inevitable path to economic conflict, if not military conflict, that there's no going back to the world that we once knew. It simply no longer exists. Thank you very much.
When I first saw your book, I thought, finally, someone's written this all down in one place. But then I was wondering, as someone who works in media, how do you write a book that's so current, where it feels like things are changing by the minute?
Well, first of all, this isn't the book that I was originally contracted to write. Penguin Random House wanted me to write a book about the economic legacy of the pandemic. You know, how lasting change, like working from home. And so it was going to be called, Is There Any Light at the End of the Tunnel? But about...
Is there?
Well, anyway, we didn't go in the tunnel. Instead, 4 to 5 months later, Russia invaded Ukraine, and the response were these massive sanctions, advertised as the severest ever imposed. So both my publisher and myself agreed that there was a bigger story here. I was able to, I don't know, keep maybe 3-4 chapters from the original book in this book, but the book took a massive U-turn, and hence why it took me over 2 years to write it, which is double what it usually takes me to write a book. So as I say, this really wasn't the book that they contracted out, but all's well that ends well.
Yes, yes. Now, you've written many other popular books, and actually, you can find them over there during the book signing part of the evening. I'm curious how this new book compares and relates to those titles and themes, because there are some dots connected.
It feels very much like my first book, which is Why Our World's About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller, which was about how triple-digit oil prices would be a threat to globalization because distance costs money. And I have an example of this, like fish caught in the salmon caught in the Norwegian Sea that's processed in China and then sent back to a supermarket in North America. Well, there's a lot of oil burnt in that process, and if oil's $20 a barrel, that's fine. But if it's $120 a barrel, that's not so fine. I think one common theme through not everyone, but certainly the first book and my last book, The Expendables, which dealt with how global trade had hollowed out the middle class, and the irony of Donald Trump, coming to the, protection of American workers, because he wasn't like a natural for that. The one common theme has been that globalization is not inevitable, and that globalization is not unambiguously positive, as we've been told. So that's one common thread.
Thanks for that. The first time I think I heard the term new normal in a way that helped me understand what was going on was likely September 13th, a couple days after September 11th. That's where we heard there's a new normal, there's a before and after.
Right.
Now, throughout history, there are moments of new normal. So I'm curious, putting this book together, what determines a new normal versus a never normal?
Well, you mentioned, of course, September 11th, and that was what you might call a black swan event. And I guess, the pandemic, which was, the greatest health crisis since the Spanish flu of 1918, could also be considered a black swan event. But they were shocks. They were ephemeral. They were fleeting, okay? What I'm talking about is not a shock. What I'm talking about is a fundamental change in the way that our economies are going to operate. And the most fundamental of those changes is trade is no longer based on comparative advantage or cost. Trade is based on geopolitics. So the foreign policies of a country is going to determine who it trades with. And that's a very, very different world than the world that we've known. I mean, China was a rival of the United States, but they were both mutually in the same system. And it was Bill Clinton who first got China into the WTO because they wanted to have access to a huge, cheap labor market. Nobody can appreciate that better than Apple, for example, and Apple's by no means alone. So we're talking about a whole different way of reorganizing the economy. And while, central bankers will get up and take bows for managing inflation with their prudent monetary management, they're on the sidelines. What really brought inflation to its knees were the trade negotiators, first with the WTO. And because what it did was it meant that you could replace high wage labor with low wage labor, and that was, we've availed ourselves for decades of consuming the fruits of cheap overseas labor, because just about everything that we consumed was made by some sweatshop on the other side of the ocean. That world's gone. So everything that we're gonna make here that we used to import from China is gonna cost a multiple of what we're accustomed to pay. Now, there's a flip side to that coin, and there's a silver lining for some of us, because at the same time, factory jobs, decent paying middle-class factory jobs that we thought were gone forever and would never come back, they're coming back. They're coming back, and all of a sudden, workers have bargaining power, and all of a sudden, the middle class is going to start to grow. So, that's the kind of trade-off that is being made here, but that is almost a throwback to the economy that we would have known like in the 1960s, where most of the things that we consumed were actually made here, but by high-wage domestic labor.
So on that, are we in a country like Canada or our neighbors to the south, the US, ready to pay for the real cost of things if made by people in our community?
Well, you see, right now it's hard for people to see because they're looking at things through the fog of war. And by that I mean, we think that propaganda is the exclusive domain of authoritarian countries. But think again. I mean, Gulf of Tonkin, Vietnam War, Saddam Hussein, weapons of mass destruction, 100,000 Iraqis get killed, when the US, wiped out Iraq with its missiles, was shock and awe, testament to the precision of US military guided weapons. But when Russia does the same to Ukraine, it's barbarous and war crimes. So when different standards are applied to different actors, we have what is called propaganda. And in a wartime, and make no mistake about it, we are at war. Propaganda serves only one purpose: to galvanize public support for the war effort. Hence, it's Putin's war. Like, he's the only person out of 144 million Russians who's taken exception to the fact that NATO's doubled after assuring Gorbachev that they wouldn't, advance 1 inch. Or President Xi is the only one of 104 billion Chinese who think that Taiwan is part of China, even though it has been since the 17th century. Well, getting to the inflation side, you're not hearing any central banks saying, forget about the 2% inflation. The world has changed, and high inflation is part of the new normal. We're pretending that it's a temporary phase, and that's a major miscalculation because the 2% inflation target, which is the inflation target of the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve Board and the Reserve Bank of Australia and the EU and the Bank of England, that relates to a very, very different economy. The pre-pandemic economy is an entirely different animal than the sanctions-ridden economy of today. And I don't think that wages are growing at 6%, that it's sustainable to have 2% inflation. So let's not make policy choices like slowing down the economy to create unemployment to bring inflation down if in fact our inflation target is not obtainable anymore on a sustainable basis. And that message has not yet been received by our central bankers as they carefully manage monetary
So
conditions.
we need new propaganda for the public to understand the rising costs?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think that this book could have been published 2 years ago because, in the media, the conflicts is a biblical conflict between good and evil. Whereas,
we like binaries in the media, I will say, as someone who works in
whereas
media.
I'm saying, The United States doesn't spend on its military more than the GDP of Africa simply to protect world democracy. There are other motivations here. This isn't good versus evil. This is Game of Thrones, so.
Now, you mentioned globalization. It comes up a lot, especially early in the book, as it relates to COVID, but also, as you've mentioned, the jobs that have moved overseas and are likely to move back in this new world order. How does that connect back to supply chain issues, sanctions, and did we learn the right things from COVID in regards to policies? Because I will say that's where so many of us were worried about getting medicine. We're stocking up on a range of items. Even, you mentioned in your book, it was a hard time to get a bicycle. It was really in our face during COVID, and are we better prepared?
Well, COVID, as I mentioned, was the first time that we began to question the efficacy of global supply chains. And that, of course, has now gone on to a much greater level with sanctions. But COVID is something else. It left, its legacy was a powder keg, just waiting to be lit. You see, deficits exploded during COVID. In Canada, the deficit went from around 30 billion to over 300 billion, like a tenfold increase in the deficit. Usually, when deficits explode, the cost of borrowing also explodes. The principle is called supply and demand, and it works to affect the government bond yield like it does the price of anything else. And that's what always in the past would keep government spending in check, because if you just spent crazy, then all of a sudden your debt servicing costs would balloon because you'd have to pay this huge interest rate to place the bonds, and that more and more tax revenue would go to bondholders instead of vote-getting program spending, and that's not without its electoral consequences. But the exact opposite happened. During the pandemic, the yield on, say, a 10-year Government of Canada bond fell to a record low 0.5%. And not to get too technical here, I know this isn't a fixed income audience, but the yield and the price of a bond are inversely related. So when the yield's at an all-time low, the price of the bond's at an all-time high. So you might ask yourself, who is buying these bonds? Normally it would be a pension plan, an insurance company, or retail investors. But why would they pay record premium prices for low yields to finance unheard of size deficits? Well, they weren't. They weren't the ones buying. The Bank of Canada was buying. They were buying at the tune of $3 billion a week. By the end of the pandemic, they owned almost 50% of all the government bonds issued. So you might ask yourself, where'd they get the money to buy all these bonds? Simple. They just printed it. It's called quantitative easing. The late, I guess, great.
I hear nervous laughter.
The late, great, I never liked him at the time, but the dictum runs very true. The late, great American economist Milton Friedman, the father of the monetarist school of economics, famous dictum was, inflation is everywhere and at all times a monetary phenomenon. And those words have never rung truer. The money supply in Canada grew at 40% during the pandemic, about 6 to 7 times its natural rate of growth. And I liken it to created a powder keg, just waiting to be lit. And sanctions against Russia that sent oil prices and food prices soaring blew that powder keg sky high. And what's left with that is the inflation that you see today. So that has been one of the lasting legacies of the pandemic.
Do you think we will be better equipped because there likely will be another pandemic in regards of Canada's needs within the country?
Well, I think we will be better positioned to make our own respirators and vaccines and masks. In fact, we just won't make that. We'll make a whole range of goods that we haven't made for years. And yes, you see, the new mantra of the economy today, in the old economy, you were supposed to specialize in what you were good at, okay? In this world, the new world order, the economy has to be a jack of all trades. You know, you have to satisfy your domestic needs with your own production, or the production of your friends. But that's entirely different than the way our economies were organized for the last 40 years, is that we just want to be specialists in what we're good at. Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage.
So building off that, I'd like to talk about hunger. You bring it up in your book. It connects back to sanctions. And food security is a top global issue in a way that might even surprise people here in Canada, for us.
Yeah. The late Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State in the United States, once quipped, "Control oil and you control nations. Control food and you control people." Let me give you an example. There's 2.5 million people in Cairo who drive cars, but all 20 million eat. And guess where they get their grain from? I think that in the end, Russia has greater leverage from its grain exports than its energy exports, because Russia is the #1 grain exporter. And these days, those kind of countries have a lot of hungry friends, particularly in the Middle East, which is singularly dependent on Russian grain. And you'll notice no African country condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Who do you think the second biggest grain exporter is? It's us, Canada. And guess what? Both Russia and Canada are benefiting from global climate change because the growing seasons are being extended. Right now, you can grow corn and soybean on the prairies. You could never do that before. So Russia and Canada's leverage is going to grow. What happens if Russia does its version of friendshoring? What happens if Russia says, we're only going to sell our grain to our friends and let other countries starve? Food is definitely a warfare front now. And our enemy just happens to be the largest grain exporter in the world, and who climate change will favor going forward as far as grain production is concerned.
I'd like to speak to the climate crisis. We now have mainstream language and goals for targets and a path perhaps to net zero, but there are big challenges outlined throughout your book. The cost of heating homes, especially in Europe, the cost of energy at large, the slow move to alternative energy, how that connects to other countries, but also coal, nuclear. In this new normal, what are the biggest factors truly holding back our progress in addressing the climate crisis, which we know will also have devastating impacts on the very issues you've just addressed?
Well, I would say that next to energy prices themselves, the biggest casualty of the sanctions imposed against Russian energy are our efforts to mitigate climate change. Because when people wonder if the lights will come on when they flick the switch, or if they'll be able to heat their homes in the winter, as they did in Germany, then concerns about global climate change quickly take a back seat to the overriding concern of energy security. Now, when sanctions were first imposed, they came with thick coats of greenwash. Since Russia was Europe's major supplier of fossil fuels, it was argued, this will simply accelerate the transition to, renewable solar wind power. It did the opposite. What replaced Russian natural gas was not wind, was not solar. It was coal. All of a sudden, coal is having a remarkable renaissance, not in so much India and China, but in Germany. Okay, in the UK, the British Parliament just passed a law for the first time in 30 years licensing a new coal mine because they expect that the thermal demand for coal is going to be so strong. So it's totally created, all of the environmental goals have been, while the government still pays lip service to them, emissions are rising. And of course, emissions are rising because they're going back to coal. They were supposed to close their last 3 coal plants. Instead, they've reopened 10 mothballed plants, and Germany's not alone. Now let's talk about us. President Biden, he likes to consider himself, big environmentalist. And he's got some pretty, ambitious environmental goals, like decarbonizing the power grid by having solar and zero emission vehicles by, 2030. Well, you can't do that when all of a sudden you don't let solar panels in from China, and they only produce about 90% of the world's solar panels. And just last week, 100% tariff on electric batteries from China. I wonder how that's going to play with the ZEV targets that he has. So Washington has totally sacrificed its environmental objectives to try to inflict economic pain on China. Will future administrations make the same choice? I don't know. I know one thing, though, that if we're concerned about BRICS' power over fossil fuels, BRICS are in a way stronger position in terms of the renewables and solar. Like the biggest nuclear provider in the world by a country mile is Rostodom, Russia's nuclear power plant. They do cradle to the grave. They'll design the reactor plant, they'll run it, they'll provide the uranium, they'll decommission it. Where reactors are being built are all through the developing world. If nuclear replaces coal, Russia's going to be the Saudi Arabia of nuclear. And when it comes to, solar panels, China may be a laggard in terms of its own emissions, but it's been very prescient about how the world will, what will be required for the world.
Yeah.
And it makes sure that it has 80% of rare earth elements, It's so, will we still choose economic warfare over environmental emission reductions in the future as the consequences of global warming become more severe? That's a dilemma that future administrations are going to have to face. But, this is being done not by the Trump administration, who doesn't believe climate change is for real. This is being done by the Biden administration that supposedly champions environmental concerns.
I have one final question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. Next week, I'm speaking at the Canadian Vote Summit, which is taking place at Toronto Metropolitan University, and it's focused on elections and democracy. This is a big election year around the world, and I want to know, what role do citizens play in this emerging new normal when it comes to voting power, be it in South Africa right now, India, you mentioned the US, big news today with 34 felony charges against Donald Trump. Curious what you think regular people, voters, can do anywhere in the world.
This is what I think. I think it's kind of interesting that America, that champions itself as the defender of democracy, yet most Americans, certainly most Republicans, have zero confidence in the democratic institutions of their country. And you might go gleefully, 34 felony charges against Trump. On the other side, the judiciary, the FBI, have been weaponized. And that's American democracy. And, you know, are we really fighting to preserve democracy in Ukraine? When was there an election in Ukraine? Oh, I forgot. The election was canceled. And is there any opposition? No, all political parties have been banned. They're simply instruments of Putin. So I don't know what the future of democracy is. Maybe democracy has a better future in BRICS, but certainly in America, a growing number of Americans do not believe in the institutions of their democracy. And after November, maybe even more.
Yeah, and we know research shows in Canada, trust is down not only in institutions, but also in media, in corporations, in places of worship. So yeah, absolutely.